These files were never meant to be public, but someone reopened them. This is the Dark Bureau. In the European imagination, borders evoke images of strict security, sharp uniforms, vigilant guards, and paperwork layered in ritualised order, an attempt to keep out threats while letting commerce through. But the real story is older. As night falls on Balkan railways, routine freight journeys conceal a parallel economy that flourished under cover of darkness. A logistics system more flexible and enduring than any modern protocol, adapting seamlessly to the ambiguity and opportunities inherent in a region repeatedly shaped by upheaval. Cargo manifests appear regular. Containers are filled with food, raw materials, and textiles. Yet beneath signed documents and stamped forms is an invisible pipeline, built not just on bribery, but on the region's deep institutional fatigue, historical complexity, and raw ingenuity. The Balkan railway network, outwardly battered by decades of war and neglect, never fully lost its purpose as connective tissue. As post-Yugoslav states fractured and official structures faltered, the railways survived as the only cohesive artery linking economies from Istanbul to Vienna. Stripped of unified oversight, but still essential, rails and stations passed into a new domain, carrying both legal recovery and the surging heroin trade, which found its perfect corridor in a system that was slow to modernise and even slower to enforce cohesion. What outsiders called transit zones and grey corridors took on a reality of blurred lines, shifting loyalties and opportunities for those cunning enough to exploit institutional ambiguity. In these shadow spaces, international syndicates, mid-level officials, and local networks converged, facilitating the movement of heroin on scales that dwarfed official seizures and outpaced efforts to restore order. This is a structural story, not just a criminal one. The destruction and partial reassembly of states created grey space, where legal and illegal blurred. Employees at depots, customs, and maintenance yards, often unpaid or pressured, adapted to survival. Bribes became standard, files went missing, and the difference between oversight and complicity narrowed to almost nothing. Enforcement officials accepted cash or subtle threats, while complex new networks thrived on loyalty built in wartime, ancestry, or acute economic need. What began as isolated acts of corruption quickly became wholesale adaptations. Humanitarian cargo rode the same trains as hidden heroin shipments. Oversight existed only as far as political will and foreign attention allowed. In the chaos, the bones of the old system, rusting tracks, patch border fences, overlapping agencies, remained, co-opted for the new trade and leaving millions downstream affected by a crisis no policy alone could deter. Even today, the residue is unmistakable. Courtrooms in Sarajevo or Skopje are crammed with cases, files half resolved, defendants vanished, evidence chains broken by bureaucracy or deliberate neglect. Customs officers process cargo in half-modernised offices, their task undermined by chronic understaffing and loyalty networks that stretch far beyond institutional chains of command. In formerly bustling border towns, warehouses and depots echo with emptiness or serve as reminders of earlier reckonings. Ambitious reform plans, sporadic crackdowns, brief hopes, and abrupt setbacks. Official narratives, the ones constructed from closed case numbers and pristine annual reports, fail to capture the real costs: addiction, entrenched violence, and abiding mistrust in institutions. The heroin epidemic that swept across Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s was not a simple lapse in enforcement, but a direct outcome of a logistics network repurposed by structural opportunism and neglect, while the region slipped from European attention. The smuggling pipeline came into view only gradually. Seemingly minor customs arrests or border seizures inevitably led investigators up the chain to patterns repeated with unnerving regularity. Most officials caught facilitating smuggling proved expendable, low-level actors who were easily replaced or silenced. But the deeper lattice became clear. Organised criminal groups tightly interlinked with parts of the bureaucracy, sometimes protected by threat, sometimes by mutual economic dependence. The collapse of old institutions following Yugoslavia's breakup left confusion. Federal police shrank into enclaves, customs agencies split, border guard and military roles blurred, oversight diluted across proliferating fiefdoms. Yet the rails still ran. Regional rail employees facing job insecurity adapted quickly, sometimes in line with personal interest, sometimes under pressure from new masters, but always in the space of what remained possible. The means meant for international recovery, aid trains, customs sidings, inspection depots, often moved heroin as quietly as any legitimate shipment. The success of the pipeline was measured in the stability of its operators and the flexibility of corrupted oversight, not the risks posed by its exposure. International scrutiny lagged. Agencies in Vienna and Geneva accrued data on seizures, celebrating each interception, but privately admitting that for every load caught, many more crossed unimpeded. Less than 5% of heroin trafficked was intercepted, even by the most optimistic estimates. Local enforcement flagged suspicious cash flows and unexplained assets. But institutional accountability remained elusive. Whistleblowers were sidelined, files vanished into classification, and honest officials often reassigned or intimidated. Agencies had overlapping, unclear mandates. Customs, police, and railway companies all bore some responsibility, but none had both the means and political support to see the full picture or pursue full-scale prosecutions. The resulting blind spots were precisely the space traffickers needed. Intentional ambiguity and the constant splitting of authority allowed the heroin pipeline to operate as a shadow mirror to the legitimate rail system. By the late 1990s, foreign crisis missions, NATO, the EU, arrived with mandates to enforce peace and restore commerce, but also to stem the rising tide of organised criminal activity. Audits began. Train manifests compared and cross-checked, discrepancies spotted as containers shifted across lines or were routed out of sequence. Aid shipments sometimes outnumbered the crises they claimed to serve. Railway and customs staff, when asked, blamed gaps on legacy schedules or paperwork errors. Only gradually did a picture form. Syndicates routed their cargo through ever-shifting shortfalls in enforcement, moving to roads or rivers as soon as rail scrutiny tightened, buying access wherever old network loyalties endured. International task forces drafted reform plans, but their mandates ended at national borders, and no single authority controlled the entire corridor. A breakthrough arrived in 2001, when a multi-nation operation, cutting across Western Europe, Turkey and the Balkans, shifted from sporadic inspections to relentless data-driven tracking. Every container from Istanbul outward was tagged, manifests matched across agencies, and financial records meticulously cross-checked. The results exposed a robust informal network. Managers, customs agents, and police commanders sharing information and profits, with systemic manipulation of timelines, duplicate documents, and entire containers disappearing temporarily along the line. This was not isolated abuse, but a coordinated repurposing. Crime as a revenue source for state remnants and syndicates alike. Public trials followed, with courtrooms displaying evidence in the form of wiretaps, coded documents, and secret cash ledgers. Prosecutors, often nudged by foreign partners, staged visible raids and brief show trials. The revelations brought widespread attention. Headlines named complicit officials. Local media tracked the fallout, and communities began to understand the scale of complicity. But victories were partial. Witnesses disappeared or recanted, new scapegoats replaced the old, and deep reforms remained elusive. On the ground, traffickers simply adapted. With rails under pressure, they moved shipments to trucks, vans or river transports, always seeking the weakest checkpoint or the most negotiable authority. The trade diffused, but its human costs lingered. Communities faced surges of street violence, addiction deepened among the young and vulnerable, and policing failures eroded civic trust. Efforts to reform the system intensified. New anti-corruption bureaus implemented digital records, biometric tracking, and basic forensic accounting. Training programs warned frontline officials of the dangers posed by coded language and suspicious paperwork. Investments in scanners and digital tools improved appearances, but persistent political obstacles remained. Rival national agencies, legacy war resentments, and enduring patronage networks blocked true transparency. Privatising cargo security or introducing outside partners sometimes only shifted opportunities for graft. The gulf between summit pronouncements and daily practice on the railway widened, and with each failed reform, public cynicism grew deeper. Many citizens, fearing exposure or retaliatory pressure, retreated from efforts at civic renewal or local oversight. For many, involvement became more risk than reward. The impact radiated outward into health and society. Hospitals and outreach centres in both the Balkans and the West struggled to meet surging demand from new waves of addiction and social breakdown. NGOs, starved of stable funding, fought uphill battles to serve smuggling towns marked by stigma and serial violence. As authorities cracked down on heroin, criminal economies diversified into fuel, migration, and arms trafficking, clinging to the logistics web built for the heroin pipeline. Each round of partial reform left the core of the shadow system untouched, available for revival by future risks or new forms of exploitation. Today, those railway lines see fewer trains, some routes modernised, others sealed by gates or shuttered entirely, deemed too poisoned by risk for legitimate restoration. Modern border sensors and e-manifests make large-scale smuggling far harder, but unresolved questions of accountability and trust remain. Journalists still report on new corruption probes, only for the suspects to vanish into procedural limbo. Attempts at public engagement are too often met with fatigue or quiet disbelief. For communities most scarred by the heroin years, the task of rebuilding trust and training resilient new officials is both urgent and daunting. Without durable institutions, the risk of history repeating itself is never far from the surface, no matter how advanced the technology on the rails. The story of the Balkan heroin pipeline is not merely a footnote in criminal history, but a warning for any system left hollow by fragmentation and opportunism. The struggle to defend European borders and rebuild faith in public service continues. Success will require transparency not just in technology or funding, but in the institutions themselves, a lesson paid for in lost decades, broken families, and the quiet endurance of those determined to reclaim the tracks for good.